to The Lamppost Listener. My name is Daniel.
I'm Phil.
And this is a podcast where we journey chapter by chapter through C.S. Lewis's Chronicles of Narnia. This is chapter 9 of The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, In the Witch's House. Welcome back, Phil.
It's good to be back, man.
I am so excited for this episode. It feels like I kind of get to exhale after how intense our last chapter was, to be honest.
There was a lot in there.
We were talking in the green room just a minute ago, and I was just like, I love, don't get me wrong, I love chapter 8. It was the most stress I've had recording this podcast because there's just so much to cover. I'm sure we didn't get to everything. I'm sure that we made some mistakes in some of the stuff we talked about, and I just feel at ease with this next chapter, which just doesn't have nearly as much exposition or world building in it. So I'm just, not to say that it's just boring by any means, but I'm just like, whew, okay, not as much to cover. So we can finally just kind of sit back a little bit and relax.
It's good to have a mix. Also, I know we're going to do the summary right after this, but let's talk about how great the first line is and kind of set up the episode.
Oh, it's wonderful. So the first line here, why don't you go ahead and read it? Because I did a lot of reading in the last episode.
I just imagine Lewis having so much fun, and
yeah.
I'm picturing it in his voice, even though I don't really know what it sounds like. And now, of course, you want to know what happened to Edmund.
Whoa, was C.S. Lewis here? You sound just like him. He had that American accent just like that. Yeah.
Yeah, I was channeling him. And now, of course, you want to know what happened to Edmund.
It's not the voice. No, that's not. That doesn't. There's actually only.
I'm pretty sure that he sounds like the guy who started Virgin Airlines.
There's actually, I think, only one recording of his voice. So you can go find it on YouTube. A lot of his, he did a lot of radio broadcasts. Like that's how Mere Christianity was at first, right? It was like a radio broadcast. Right. But I think most of his audio recordings have been lost. Like it's not like we just could save them on a computer like you do now. I think there's only one recording I've ever found. There might be more, but I've only ever been able to find one on YouTube and stuff. And it's still really interesting to hear someone's voice that you've read so much of, because I can, in my head, like when you read this stuff, like, and now of course you want to know what has happened to Edmund. I can like hear his voice, but I'm not actually hearing his voice. I'm hearing what I, for decades now of reading his works, have pictured as his voice. So like anything I hear isn't going to sound right because I have the voice that I think C.S. Lewis talks in my head. And so I remember listening to it for the first time, I was like, that's not how C.S. Lewis sounds. This is an imposter. Yeah, no, this isn't right.
Yeah. You felt the same way when I did it, exactly like his voice. So,
yeah.
Who knows?
Well,
one quick thing about C.S. Lewis, funny story from college. I had a friend who was sitting on the couch and he said something about C.S. Lewis, and the other person said, yeah, it's a real shame that he died. And he goes, C.S. Lewis isn't dead. And the other person's like, yeah, he is. He's like, no, he's been tweeting all week.
Oh,
no. It was a rough day for my friend. He was not joking.
Oh, no. He died in November of 1963 because he died on the same day.
Shortly after I started college.
Yep, that's right. He died the same day as JFK was assassinated, and Aldous, I don't know if I'm saying his name right, Huxley, who wrote Brave New World. This is dangerous. I'm going to go ahead and say November 22nd, 1963. This might be the next part of our next episode, the first part where we have to make a correction. But I do want to say it's November 22nd, 1963. Yeah, it's one of those things where I think his death actually wasn't covered that much because, especially here in the States, because obviously a president being assassinated made a lot more headline news than a famous author in another country passing away. You know what I mean?
I'm being handed a report. It was November 22nd, 1963.
Oh, yes. All right. I'm proud of myself. Also, for listeners, I will go ahead and I'll put the link to that audio recording of C.S. Lewis. So if you haven't heard him speak before, I'll try to find it and put it in the link below.
So do you think the two deaths were connected?
Not at all.
Me either.
There's actually, last thing, and then we'll get into the episode. There's a book written. I don't remember what the book's called. I'll see if I can find it and post a link to like Amazon or something about what those, I don't think it's written by a Christian or anything, but I think there's a book about like what it would have been like of like Huxley and Lewis and JFK all showing up in the afterlife is like. I've never read it. I have no idea if it's good or not. I just know that it exists. I think it's called, Here, I just found it. Here we go. It's called Between Heaven and Hell. I know nothing about it. I don't know if it's from a Christian perspective or no. Publisher InterVarsity Press. So there you go.
Oh,
I'll go ahead and post a link to that. I kind of want to read that. Maybe I'll read that after we're done with this season. I'll go ahead and see if I can pick that book up.
I thought you were going to say after this series. I'm like, that's going to be like the year 2049.
Yeah, no. That's like your go-to year right now, man. Everything. You just did you rewatch Blade Runner 2049 recently?
I'm trying to like build this like thing where it's like the same number every time, and you just called attention to it. So,
oops, sorry. All right, so let's go ahead. We're a couple minutes into this episode now. We're getting off track a little bit. Let's talk about Chapter 9 in the Witch's House. So I have my chapter summary here. Are you ready?
I'm ready.
After hearing the whole arrangement for meeting Aslan at the stone table, Edmund slips into the cold forest as dusk is falling. As he walks between the snow-covered trees, Edmund thinks about his new life as prince over Narnia. He plans to build some decent roads, have his own theater, and create laws against beavers and dams. He's also convinced himself that the witch won't be nearly as bad as the beavers make her out to be. Eventually, he arrives at the witch's house. It's a towering, ominous fortress of spires and towers. Inside the gates, Edmund stumbles upon a courtyard of Narnian statues. He is terrified when he comes across Malgrim the wolf. Malgrim takes Edmund to see the witch, who is furious at Edmund for coming alone. When she learns that his siblings are not far away, she prepares her sledge for the beaver's dam. 150 words.
Exactly.
Yeah. 150 words. I'm really proud of that.
I dare anyone to fact check us on that.
Let's go ahead. Can I read, Phil, the first paragraph of this chapter?
Let's hear it.
I love this because we spoke about it at the beginning of this episode. We are just, C.S. Lewis's voice comes roaring back to life here. And now, of course, you want to know what had happened to Edmund. He had eaten his share of the dinner, but he hadn't really enjoyed it because he was thinking all the time about Turkish delight. And there's nothing that spoils the taste of good ordinary food half as much as the memory of bad magic food. And I got to stop there for a second because I love how frankly C.S. Lewis just tells us, oh, obviously we all know that bad magic food just really spoils some good real food. Yep. And he had heard the conversation and hadn't enjoyed it much either, because he kept on thinking that the others were taking no notice of him and trying to give him the cold shoulder. They weren't, but he imagined it. And then he had listened until Mr. Beaver told him about Aslan, and until he had heard the whole arrangement for meeting Aslan at the stone table. It was then that he began very quietly to edge himself under the curtain which hung over the door. For the mention of Aslan gave him a mysterious and horrible feeling, just as it gave the others a mysterious and lovely feeling. And that's the first paragraph of this chapter, and I just love that. I mentioned it already but I missed having Lewis's I missed having him narrate the story, which we didn't really have a lot of in the last chapter, and it's wonderful to have him kind of back as he almost is a character. Don't you feel like that?
I do, yeah.
And it's just great to have him back.
I'm a big fan of dialogue-heavy stuff without too much explanation, but I also really appreciate this. So it's nice that we have one chapter with mostly dialogue, and then this one where the narrator is more present.
I will say that's one of the things I've noticed as we kind of are reading this much slower, right, than you usually would read this book. We're reading literally like a chapter every other week, so we're taking it very slowly. And I'm comparing kind of more chapter to chapter. I mean, I know when I usually read books, or especially when I've read the Narnia books, unless I'm in school with my students, I usually can read a couple chapters at a time. But with reading it just one chapter at a time, I'm realizing how almost episodic each of the chapters are. And I guess, that's kind of a point of a chapter, but they are, but I know this is a very groundbreaking discovery I've now uncovered here in the year 2018. But it's
like a really nicely packaged section of a story almost.
Yeah, you don't have to make fun of me. But yeah, I mean, it's each one is so different. This is such a different approach to even storytelling than the last episode was, the last chapter was, and I really love that. I hadn't noticed that before, and I've read this book many, many times.
So I enjoy it too, but I also, again, I brought this up last episode, but I feel a little too close to Edmund sometimes, and when he hears the conversation and they're not really taking notice of him, and he feels like they're trying to give him the cold shoulder, even though they aren't, he's imagining it. That really hits home for me. I definitely deal with that um, feeling, even though it's not something I should feel. But then I do feel a little bit better because the name of Aslan so far doesn't give me a mysterious and horrible feeling. It gives me a mysterious and lovely feeling.
I really love that section right there that you just mentioned about him, like, and just the way C.S. I mean, who knows it? The way that I'm reading it in my head, and I think the way I just read it now is like, they weren't, but he imagined it, right? Like, no one's doing that, but he thought they were.
It's very frank. The witch is bad. Aslan's good. The fig is bad.
And the way that that very short sentence, I feel like is C.S. Lewis kind of putting it. It almost forces me into Edmund's shoes. Like I'm like, oh man. I can definitely think of a time where I'm like, oh man, so-and-so's mad at me. Or, oh, I'm just like, you just sit there and you're kind of like festering in your frustration at someone, right? And it's like that person is completely unaware or didn't even mean to like slight you or anything like that. But you just sit there being angry at them. It's like, they weren't, but you were, you know?
And everything they do is evidence to your case, even though to them it means something completely different.
Absolutely. So we move on as Edmund is walking through the woods. C.S. Lewis is something that's very interesting, and I can't wait to hear your take on this portion of the text because of the way that you've been relating to Edmund. So here on page 89, which I guess, again, that doesn't mean anything to you.
Page 151.
It says, C.S. Lewis writes, "You mustn't think that even now Edmund was quite so bad that he actually wanted his brother and sisters to be turned into stone. He did want Turkish delight, and to be a prince, and later a king, and to pay Peter out for calling him a beast. As for what the witch would do with the others, he didn't want her to be particularly nice to them, certainly not to put them on the same level as himself, but he managed to believe, or to pretend he believed, that she wouldn't do anything very bad to them. Because, he said to himself, all these people who say nasty things about her are her enemies, and probably half of it isn't true. She was jolly nice to me, anyway, much nicer than they are. I expect she is the rightful queen, really. Anyway, she'll be better than that awful Aslan." At least, that was the excuse he made in his own mind for what he was doing. It wasn't a very good excuse, however, for deep down, inside, he really knew that the White Witch was bad and cruel. What is your take on that?
This, to me, is exactly how sin goes from being something small to something big, because we lie to ourselves about it. And it's something that is so important to be aware. And like, even though I'm talking about it, I still know that this is going to be something I'll struggle with throughout the rest of the day and tomorrow. It's like, there are things that we know are wrong, and yet we're still going to keep doing them. And we'll try to justify it. Like, we know we shouldn't eat certain things, or we shouldn't, be around certain things, and yet we kind of justify it, like, oh, well, you can't really expect me to do this, or it's not so bad, or that would be so extreme to not do this.
Wait, what things can't we eat?
Anything with hooves, I think.
There you go. No, but I totally understand what you're saying. I think
shouldn't eat sugar. It's poison. That's what I read today.
Okay. This to me is also, Edmund has gone from being kind of flirting with, not evil, kind of, because the witch is evil, but with like flirting with evil, to now he's on her side. Like, he's not just, he's kind of on in that gray area, like he's not really on Aslan's side, but he's not on the witch's side. He's now, even before he's actually arrived at the house and sold his brother and sisters out, he's made the decision. Like, in his heart, he has decided that she's the rightful queen, and she's way better than awful Aslan. Like, this to me is him actually. This is where the betrayal occurs in my mind. Right. Before he actually acts it out, but when in his heart he's made that decision.
I think as he's slipping out the door, he's slipping under her power.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah. By the way, is there a door, or is it just that curtain? I'm confused because it says that, if we go back a little bit, it says he kind of slips under the curtain, right? Under the curtain which hung over the door. So is there no door, or is there just a curtain on top of the door?
I can't imagine they don't have a door.
They have to have a door, right? It'd be super cold.
Yeah.
I mean, they're animals. They don't usually have homes to begin with, so.
I'm really looking forward to this movie because I think it's going to answer or solve a lot of these problems.
Yeah, but the thing is, we can't always consider the movie to be canon. It's not. That's a adaptation of this story. Doesn't necessarily mean that's what's happening here.
You're right.
Because in my mind, still, I know this isn't right. In my mind, often I sometimes picture the beavers as still being the human-sized version that they are in the BBC adaptation.
Are they really human-sized? Oh no.
Yeah, you haven't. Oh man, I can't wait till we watch it together. They are. It's just two people just standing in like these beaver suits.
Right. In this story, I do picture the beavers as beaver-sized, don't you?
Now I do, but for a very long time, they were definitely human-sized. Because I read the books first and then watched the BBC adaptations. But you know how often when you know, I love the Lord of the Rings books. I love the movies too. I think the movies are some of the best films ever made. I still like the books more. But when I read the books, even if it sometimes conflicts with the description in the text itself, 9 times out of 10 I'm picturing the characters and even the settings to look like they do in the film, even when it doesn't quite line up, because it's just easier for me to picture that, right? Like
Definitely.
I've seen those films so many times that I can picture them. And the same thing kind of happens for Narnia. I'm not as familiar with the Narnia movies. Like we talked about this before, so it's not like 9 times out of 10. It's maybe like half the time I picture kind of my own interpretation, and half the time I picture maybe like, I'm not going to get in all the, and some of the times I picture the Disney adaptation, and some of the times I picture the BBC adaptation. I never picture the CBS's cartoon adaptation. That never comes into my mind.
Man, I completely forgot about that one until you said that.
I remember it looking kind of like the Yellow Submarine Beatles cartoon.
And that I do remember.
Oh, yeah. So at this point, Edmund is traveling through the woods, and we learn a little bit about how it's somewhat difficult to kind of get across where he's going to. It stops snowing, and he kind of sees the moon overhead. We just get a lot of beautiful descriptions of this land. Was there anyone in particular that stood out to you?
Oh, let's talk about the roads.
Okay.
I love the transition. He's, meaning Lewis, describing the snowflakes and how you could hardly see 3 feet ahead. And then there was no road. And he keeps slipping on the deep drifts of snow and skidding on frozen puzzles. That's like Spy Kids 1 or Spy Kids 2 when the floor becomes a puzzle.
I don't remember that at all.
Oh, well, that'll be our next podcast in 5 years.
There we go.
2049.
There you go.
He says, Lewis says, it was growing darker every minute. And what with that and the snowflakes swirling all around him, he could hardly see 3 feet ahead. And then he points out that there's no road and that he's slipping on the deep drifts of snow and skidding on frozen puddles. And then it transitions to Edmund saying, when I'm king of Narnia, the first thing I shall do will be to make some decent roads. And of course, that set him off thinking about being a king and all the other things he would do. And this cheered him up a good deal. It's such a great transition from the scenery to Edmund's reaction about the scenery, which leads to the thought about being king again. And he's just going further down the path, both literally and figuratively. It's just a really nice passage right there.
And it also makes me think about the problem with imagination sometimes, right? Like, I mean, this is a book that's highly imaginative. Obviously, you and I both love fantasy and other, science fiction, other things that are very heavily, very imaginative. We're not just talking, regular old realistic fiction, which isn't bad, but is grounded in reality. We're talking about a magical land with all these, crazy creatures. And so we would think imagination is always just this wonderful creative force. And yet here, Edmund's imagination leads him down the wrong path, right? Lewis says right before that part you just read, and this is him speaking in first person, C.S. Lewis, in fact, I really think he might have given up the whole plan and gone back and owned up and made friends with the others if he hadn't happened to say to himself, and then there's the when I'm king part. So in this part, his imagination, his mind leads him down the wrong path. And this is, to me, this is so interesting because as I'm reading this book, I'm usually thinking about this as being a very like imagination being a perfect thing, right?
Right. And I think we grow up thinking that imagination is good, and it is, but it can also be used to imagine bad stuff. And so I'm curious what you think. What do you think Edmund really wants here? Because it kind of shows in his actions what his priorities are.
I think he really wants some roads. I think he wants that's a good question. Let me kind of process this out loud because I haven't thought about that. I think Edmund is being motivated by greed here. I think greed and then also pride. I think those are the two things. We hear he wants the private cinema. He wants he has many cars, right? Mm-hmm. He wants his own palace. But then in the same sentence, he wants laws against beavers and dams and he wants to put Peter in his place. So I think the two things for me are greed and pride. That's what's motivating him.
Yeah, and pride being like the biggest part. I think the greed would fuel the pride part, especially.
Absolutely, yeah.
And you see it earlier when he doesn't feel like they're paying attention to him. Like he doesn't feel important, and what he's walking towards is something that he thinks will solve that problem.
It's like the classic middle child syndrome, right? There he's not the oldest, he's not the youngest, he's just, he's there and he feels left out, Yeah. So he arrives. He arrives at the witch's house, which, why do they call this a house? It's definitely not a house. It's throughout the entire book. We're like, we hear both castle, but they also use the term house. And I'd love to know the etymology of what's happening here. Of why are we using the word house?
I'm curious too, but she's not really a queen. Maybe Lewis is taking subtle jabs at her assumed royalty.
Oh, I hadn't thought about that.
I don't really think he's doing that, but
no, I just think it's just the way he likes to write, and it's fun. The White Witch's house. I think it's almost like derogatory, right? Like, she shouldn't have a castle, it's just her little house,
Oh, is that your house? The witch's apartment.
Yeah, that would be great. I want to ask you, we sometimes talk about illustrations. I want to ask what your illustration is. I know you only get them at the beginning of your chapters. There's an illustration of Edmund looking at the witch's house. Do you have this at all in your text?
I don't, but I do have Edmund looking at a giant wolf, and I love the size of the wolf.
Oh, we're not there yet.
Chapter 9. Well, it's at the beginning of chapter 9 for me, so
it already happened.
The canon version.
It's this. I don't want to talk too much with the illustration. I'd rather talk about the descriptive language used because that's something we can talk about here on an audio podcast. There's the idea of the witch's house being a bunch of just towers is interesting to me because that's not what I think of when I think of a castle, right? I mean, I guess you can think of something like a Cinderella's castle, like at Disney World or something, which has lots of spires and stuff. But this, to me, like in my head, and that's even the way that Pauline Baines has illustrated it, it's like this kind of big block that just has a bunch of like spires on the top of it. And it doesn't look like a very regal castle. It's not very beautiful. Like, it's not the kind of castle that even as I'm reading it, take away the illustration, but even as I'm reading it, I'm not like, oh man, I have to go visit that thing. Like, it's, whereas when we get the description of Cair Paravel, I'm just blown away by like how much I need to be there, right?
Right.
And I kind of like that her castle isn't, in the same way that she's not really the queen, it's not like really the traditional castle.
Yeah, and it also has a scary description too. Little towers with long pointed spires on them, sharp as needles. That the sharper something is, the more dangerous it appears. I really like how he does that. And then it says they looked like huge dunces' caps or philosophers' caps.
I love that.
Sorcerers' caps.
Yeah. Is it your Harry Potter joke for the episode?
That's it.
Yeah, I also like putting the dunces and philosophers right next to one another. I think that's kind of a Lewis, joke. And does it say philosophers? I think it always says sorcerers.
It does, but I was doing
You're
the
just
British
making the
version.
joke. Okay. But yeah, I really like that passage. So
and how the long shadow looks strange on the snow.
Oh, yeah, that's kind of creepy.
Again, bringing us back to the ice part. And, like, where is it lit from? It must be the moon, I guess. But
I mean,
it's a creepy description.
Yeah, C.S. Lewis writes that it's this snow-covered landscape, and so I think the moon is really brightening up when it's reflecting off of the snow. It's brightening up the whole thing. So I think that's probably why you can see. So Edmund arrives at the White Witch's house, and he walks into the courtyard, into the gates, and he finds a stone lion there. And who is that stone lion?
Is it Aslan?
It's not. Well, we actually don't know, do we?
That's the question.
I guess if you're reading...
But to him, he thinks it might be Aslan. It's a lion, and he thinks it's real at first, and then it doesn't move. And he kind of inches closer toward it, and then he realizes that it's a stone lion.
And he does the most juvenile thing you could do here. Because who hasn't done this as a child in elementary or middle school, right? When you get like your history textbook. I know I definitely used to always do that. Or like in the newspaper and stuff. And he gets out a lead pencil. We got to make sure we understand it's a lead pencil. And
it was a different time. We didn't know how bad lead was.
Yeah, I know. But it's just funny that we even just like we can't just write pencil. We got to write lead pencil. And he draws spectacles and a mustache on the lion. And it's just like, oh, it's one of those middle school things where you think you're so funny and you are just so not funny. You know?
And it's mean for no reason.
Oh yeah.
Like, why would you do that?
It's one of the, I mean, when I would do this, I think back to like why I would do this on like in history textbooks. It's done out of this huge, I mean, think about life in middle school, right? It's just done out of this huge insecurity. And so anyone else that I can bring down makes me feel better about myself. Right?
Yeah. That's definitely it.
And Edmund is afraid of this whole thing. He knows what he's doing is wrong, and all of this just makes him feel a little bit better about his own situation. So he gets after the lion. Can I read this section of text about the courtyard?
Let's hear it.
As he got into the middle of it, he saw that there were dozens of statues all about, standing here and there rather as the pieces stand on a chessboard when it is halfway through the game. There were stone satyrs and stone wolves and bears and foxes and catamountains of stone. There were lovely stone shapes that looked like women but who were really the spirits of trees. There was the great shape of a centaur and a winged horse and a long, lithe creature that Edmund took to be a dragon. They all looked so strange standing there perfectly lifelike and also perfectly still in the bright cold moonlight that it was eerie work crossing the courtyard. Right in the very middle stood a huge shape like a man, but as tall as a tree, with a fierce face and a shaggy beard and a great club in its right hand. Even though he knew that it was only a stone giant and not a live one, Edmund did not like going past it.
God, it's so cool.
Oh, it's so good. And one thing I took away from this that I've never gotten out of the story before is I thought back to chapter 2 of this book, obviously. And just in case anybody's wondering, I thought back to chapter 2 and the description of Narnia before the witch and before winter that Mr. Tumnus gives us, which is kind of another one of these where you get these very long, almost seemingly run-on sentences of just all these different creatures and all these different mythologies kind of pushed together. And in that one, we get this beautiful picture of, what used to be in Narnia. There's this longing for this return for that, even though we don't even understand the full depth of the brokenness of this world. And here, it's the same kind of thing, but it's like all destroyed. Like it's the backdrop of what used to be and now is just stone. And it's this very sad thing. It kind of mirrors that passage, and it makes me just really sad for what has become of all these creatures.
Yeah. I'm also curious what it looked like. Does she walk them out and say like strike a pose and then turns them to stone? Does she turn them to stone then have them hauled back? Like it's a really cool scene, but and the power to turn a dragon into stone, that's pretty formidable.
Yeah, that's a good question. I guess, are they movable? These are the questions that need answers. This is why we did the podcast. I would assume that they're frozen in their place, right? And
that's what it looks like. It looks like they're so lifelike. It looks like they just stopped, like in the middle of action or something.
Yeah, it almost makes it so much more terrifying or like horrific, because this is almost like an execution area. It's like they're led out to this execution courtyard, and for all they know, turning to stone, like, I mean, that you're dead, right? Like they don't have hope like we do right now of, they don't know that Aslan is returned when they're turned to stone right now. And so this is like, that's the end.
Permanent.
Yeah. Oh, this is like so much more terrifying now as I think of it as like this kind of execution area. So then, Phil, tell us what happens as Edmund finally makes it through this courtyard.
This is a really packed last page. Edmund makes it past the line. He goes, "It's all right. It's all right. It's only a stone wolf. It can't hurt me." As he continues walking on. And then someone says, "Who's there?" He says who he is, that he's the son of Adam. He's come to see the queen. And the person that hears him, the wolf, goes to get the queen. And then this is a great line. He goes, how do you say it? Malgrim?
Malgrim.
The chief of the witches' secret police, the one who wrote the note earlier, comes bounding back and says, come in. Fortunate favorite of the queen, or else not so fortunate." I don't know exactly what that means, but that's terrifying.
Well, it's just that she's allowed him to enter into her court. I mean, that's a big deal. And so it seems like, oh, you have her favor, but we know that she's an evil queen. So it's like, is it really the favor to be brought into the queen's, like this evil queen's throne room? You know,
and then her reaction to him being there is, "How dare you come alone?" That's the first thing she says. Ooh. In a terrible voice. "Did I not tell you to bring the others with you?" And he stammers out the reason why he did what he did. And she says, "Ready our sledge." And I love that last line. You want to read that?
Yeah, so, but the queen, who was no longer attending to him, clapped her hands. Instantly, the same dwarf whom Edmund had seen with her before appeared. "Make ready my sledge," ordered the witch, "and use the harness without bells."
We're going into stealth mode.
Oh, that's so terrifying. It's just like, yeah, I love like that we've now like ramped up all of the tension. Right? So like we get chapter 8 sets us up for what's going to happen with the rest of the story with all that exposition. And then we just kind of hit the ground running here in chapter 9 with like, oh my goodness, now they're coming. Like I love it.
Oh yeah.
Any last thoughts, Phil, on this chapter before we wrap it up?
I just want to affirm what you said about the tension that you're feeling right there at the end. I have not read ahead yet.
Oh.
And I'm really excited to move on to the next chapter. I might have to get started right after this.
Yeah. So we end here with the White Witch preparing that sledge. It's not clear right now if she's traveling to the Beaver's Dam or if she's already figured out that they have left and she wants to intercept them. But we just know that she's going after them, wherever that may be. And that's quite a terrifying predicament that they're in right now. So we're going to have next time, chapter 10, the spell begins to break, which, if I'm honest, sometimes I get frustrated with these chapter titles because it's like we end on this really, kind of big cliffhanger of, oh my gosh, they're going after him. And then we get, oh, the spell begins to break. Like, right. Just a little bit, kind of relieving a little bit of that tension, which I guess in a child's book is maybe helpful. But I'm like, oh, I want it to be like something scary happens, chapter 10. Yeah,
It is helpful when you go back through because you can kind of look at the chapters and see. It gives you enough that you know what happens. It's like on Netflix where you have like a quick little either title or summary of what happens in that episode so you can kind of find your place. But it does, like, you don't want it spoiled.
Yeah, it's not fun. But anyway, in this next, I won't say too much, in this next chapter, chapter 10, a person, let's just say a unexpected guest arrives in Narnia. That's all I'll say.
I bet it's Mrs. McCready.
That's it. Miss McCready stumbles into it. She's now here to save the day.
Game changer.
You can go ahead and follow us into the world of Narnia on our Twitter and Facebook pages. You can also email us at thenarniapodcast@gmail.com. We'd also appreciate a review on Apple Podcasts because this helps other listeners find the show. Our show's themes were created by Kevin MacLeod, and you can find more of his work in the links in the episode's description below. They'll be alongside those other links I talked about at the very beginning of the episode. Thank you for coming along on this journey, and we'll be back next time for Chapter 10.